Hey guys, before we get started, I want to give a quick note that some of the pronunciations within this episode of names and places were challenging, to say the least. So please understand that I did my best to give the pronunciations what they deserved, but I am not perfect. So before anybody comes for me about pronunciations, I do my best. I try really hard to make sure that they are accurate as possible. So I hope you do enjoy this episode. Welcome back, Spooky Souls, to the first Let's Talk Spooky episode of 2026. I am your host, Shauna, and I want to wish you all a happy new year. I hope that everybody had a safe and peaceful holiday, and if you did anything spooky, please share with us. We want to hear it. Also, before we get into tonight's episode, I want to give a shout out to all of my new followers and those who have been supporting the show since it first started. I am so grateful to you all, and as we enter a new year, I can't wait to see how much our little podcast grows. So I figured what better way to start off our brand new year and our brand new episodes with a bit of an exploration over multiple episodes of one of my favorite folklore creatures, and that's the vampire. But before we do vampires, we have to go way back in time. And I'm not talking the Bram Stoker and Twilight vampires. I'm talking about the vampires that went by a different name. So if you're ready, light a candle, dim the lights, and let's talk spooky. Vampires haven't always looked the way we imagine them in modern times. The change is mostly influenced by pop culture. Think Damon Salvatore, Lestat, Queen of the Damned. And just a side note for all you Vampire Diary lovers out there, I was always Team Damon. I feel I might get hate for that, but I would have definitely invited him in. Just a side note. But for most of history, vampires weren't the romantic, aristocratic figures of seduction that we think of today. They were created by folklore as a symbol, an explanation of sorts to make sense of an unexpected illness, a sudden death, or essentially any reason why a loved one would waste away without explanation. In medieval Europe, the returning of the dead were feared not because they were monstrous creatures that came alive at night, but they were familiar. They looked like their neighbors, family members, people they loved, and who died under the very strange or wrong circumstances. These early vampire-like creatures were not beautiful, but bloated, heavy, and silent. They essentially were literal decomposing bodies reanimated to life. And their tales were often the blame for essentially anything that went wrong. Wasting of illness, failed crops, explanation of slow draining life within their communities. When these beliefs spread eastward and southward, they became changed. In Slavic and Balkan regions, vampire lore took a sharper turn. Stalking, deception, blood became the center focus, the lust that built these vampires into a little bit more of what we recognize today. The undead were no longer restless, predatory spirits. They were living, breathing, essentially, creatures of the night. But it wasn't really until the 18th and 19th century that vampires truly transformed. With the rise of Gothic literature, vampires shifted from rural fear to literary fear. Writers reshaped old folklore stories of aristocrats with the desire and power associated with the longing, lusting for blood. By the time Dracula entered cultural imagination, the vampires of the past were no longer warnings of improper death. They were symbols of temptation, of corruption, and of forbidden longing. But modern media has pushed that transformation even further. Vampires became tragic, symbolic representations of misunderstood heroism. Immortality was framed as a gift, and monsters were softened and romanticized to be a bit more digestible. But this evolution hides something incredibly important: that long before vampires were beautiful, they were deliverers of consequence. And some of our early, most documented vampire lore may surprise you. Ireland was one of the earliest examples of where vampire lore never fully crystallized into a single monster type. Older beliefs survived beneath the surface, but the stories of revenants, the returning of the dead, they shaped the injustice and silence that embodied what remained of the person who was taken too soon. And that's where we're going to start our episode today. We're going to explore the Irish beginning lores of the vampire. And then from there, we're going to move across the countries to where the beautiful New Orleans vampires came into play. Our first vampire-like story comes from an Irish folktale of the Dearg-Due, a woman who is known for her heartbreakingly sad story, but also for her revenge. Born in a time when her beauty was not a protection but danger. Her name now has been lost to history, but she was remembered by her appearance. Strikingly beautiful pale skin, red hair, and a stillness about her that drew people in. Men noticed her, families would discuss her beauty, and before she was old enough to refuse, her father had sealed her fate. She was married off to a powerful landlord that was both wealthy, well-respected, but incredibly cruel. The house she was brought to was large and well-kept, but it was not a home, and she was watched consistently by her husband's help. Her movements were restricted, her voice discouraged, and though her husband did not strike her openly, it seemed that there was no need, because the control he kept was quieter than violence, and much more effective. In some versions of the narrative, she was locked in a single room and cut whenever she was disobedient. This left bloodstains on the wall of her room, and is questioned about where the story of blood and vampires became connected. But most of the stories talk about how she was allowed to exit, but she was never truly allowed to leave. Over time, she began to grow thin, her laughter disappeared, her beauty faded into something more brittle and strained looking. Those who passed the house said they rarely saw her outdoors, and when they did, she walked with her eyes lowered, almost afraid to be noticed. She seemed to be almost a hollow shell of her former self. In some tellings, she wasted away from sorrow, but in others, she chose to take her own life, and rather than endure another winter of isolation. But it's not the way she ended that makes the story. You see, she died unseen, unheard, and with no one to mourn her, or no one who cared to. She was buried near what is now known as Waterford, beneath a tree that would later be known as Strongbow Tree, and for a time, that's when this story ended. But as for folklore, we know that if it ended there, we wouldn't be talking about it. Not long after her burial, men in the surrounding countryside began to fall ill. Strong men returned home pale, weakened after an evening spent away, and they complained of exhaustion and a sleep that could not cure, a strange heaviness on their chest, and dreams filled with a woman's pale appearance and voice speaking softly through the dark. Some spoke of meeting her on a lonely road near the edge of a field, but they always said she was beautiful, she was gentle, and she always asked them to come closer. Those who were not found dead at least not at first. They lingered and diminished slowly, as though something had been drained out of them. The villagers began to whisper of the woman that they had buried beneath the tree had returned. But she did not tear the flesh or hunt violently. She did not rage against the living as you would think. She chose her men carefully. In many versions of the tale, her victims were men who mirrored her husband's cruelty towards women, and men who took without consequence, who believed themselves above or untouchable. And she did not feed on the blood alone, but the vitality of the individual, on the strength, and on what once was denied to her. When the pattern became clear, the villagers knew what had to be done. They went to the place of her grave, and they placed heavy stones upon it, sealing the earth so she could no longer rise from it. Then they sat and waited. They did not pray her name loudly. They did not speak of her. They acted quickly, quietly, understanding that the spirits are not necessarily banished, but mostly contained within the rocks. Even now, folklore warns that if the stones are removed, that she will return. Old stories like this remind us that if suffering is ignored and cruelty is permitted, and that when voices are buried alongside the bodies, that sometimes what returns from that is far worse than what was lost. But isn't that where monsters are born? From the betrayal and loneliness transformed into something monstrous to explain away the guilt of that betrayal. So if you're visiting Ireland, or if you call it home and you're listening, you can go to the location where the legend is believed to blend with history. Her resting place is said to lie in Waterford, under the old strongbow tree, a location that is tied a little bit more to memory than to maps. There is no marked gravestone there. There's no confirmed burial. Only the oral tradition that has been passed down for generations. But I do encourage you, if you do go, leave a flower beneath the tree. And remember her for a woman who was removed from her home and forced into a life of domestic abuse and heartbreak. Not for the monster the history books remember her as. So we can see that before vampires were given names and rules and teeth, Ireland carried a deep unease about the dead who did not stay dead. And the fear was not centered necessarily on monsters, but on the unfinished lives of those who were affected, on death that came too quickly, and the wrongs that were never answered for. Irish folklore didn't imagine the returning of the dead as foreign or exotic. They returned as themselves, familiar, recognizable, unsettlingly precise, because they belonged there. A neighbor, a family member, someone who should not have died, who should have remained at rest. Across the country, stories were told of the dead who moved about, of bodies that did not decay properly, of graves that required stones or iron to be carefully put upon them, or careful rites to be kept where they lay so that they did not rise again. But these beliefs were not sensational. They were everyday practicalities, rooted in an understanding of death, and how, when it's mishandled or ignored, could disturb the balance between the living and the dead. What's important about Irish revenants was they were rarely destroyed, but they were contained. Stones were piled, graves were sealed, names were forgotten, and boundaries were reinforced. The goal was not for punishment. The goal was to restore order. A line between the living and the dead had been crossed, and that needed to be fixed. Another famous Irish folklore is that of Abhartach. In the north of Ireland, near what is now known as County Derry, There was once a chieftain named Abhartach, and he ruled a small territory with an iron fist. You see, the Ireland of that time was ruled more wildly than it is today. If a chieftain was good and cared for his people, then the people prospered. But if he wasn't, well, I'm sure you can see where I'm going. But Abhartach was remembered not for strength and wisdom, but he was remembered for his cruelty. He demanded obedience without mercy, and he ruled through intimidation rather than loyalty. The land didn't prosper under him. Instead, it felt like a darkness had settled. And as most cruel men are, he dealt with his inner demons. His wife, you see, was the most beautiful woman in the village. And because of this, he would not let a single man lay eyes upon her out of jealousy. So he did what cruel men do, and he locked her away in a large tower and left her there alone. But one night, his jealousy got the best of him, and he thought she might have taken up with a guard. So he scaled the tower wall under the light of a full moon, and when he got to the top, he peered through a crack in the mortar. And what he saw was that she was alone. But what he didn't expect was that she would see him. And she let out a blood-curdling scream that startled him so much that he fell backwards, breaking his neck instantly at the bottom of the tower. Now, you would think that the village would mourn their chieftain, but they didn't. They in fact celebrated. They buried him as they would a chieftain, even though he had cruel manners, and they moved on. They watched their little village take in new life, and they felt they were free of an evil man and the dark shadow that had followed him. But the next full moon came, and Abhartach returned. He rose from his grave, came back among the living, pale as death and eyes glassy white. He did not rage or threaten. Instead, he demanded, "Give me substance," he would scream. And as his people brought him water and ale, he screamed at them, "No, give me substance." And soon they realized what he wanted. Bowls of human blood, taken from the people who had once lived under his rule. But the terrified villagers, they knew something had to be done. So the next night when he rose, they killed him again. Once more burying him as you would a chieftain, standing straight up in his grave. And once more, he rose. Each time he returned and demanded the blood of his people. Each burial failed, and Abhartach soon began to not decay. He became stronger, and they realized that the more blood he obtained, the more death seemed to avoid or reverse. The people finally understood that Abhartach was no longer just a simple man, that he became something much scarier, something much older, a revenant, animated not by hunger alone, but of dominion that he refused to let yield. In desperation, the village sought counsel, and in some stories it was of a holy man, in others a warrior. But regardless of what tale you follow, the instructions were precise. Abhartach would be not killed by the ordinary blade. He must be struck with a sword made of the Yule tree, which was long associated in Ireland with death, burial, and other worldly creatures. When he was slain finally, he was not buried as he had been before, instead of burying upright, he was buried upside down. His grave was sealed with thorns and ash and covered in heavy stone plates, not to punish him or to kill him, but to hold him in place. The villagers followed these instructions exactly, and Abhartach was struck with a Yule blade and fell to his death. And he did not rise again. His body was inverted into the earth upside down beneath the stones and the branches that were lay above him, and the land became undisturbed, and the people began to believe. Once morning came and went, that night Abhartach did not return. The place where he was buried became known as Abhartach's grave, and the traditions and warnings that followed that site stated that it should never be disturbed, not because Abhartach was defeated forever, but because he was contained, and disturbing that containment would unleash a creature that the world was not ready. And in Irish folklore, it's common for the distinction of the dead being buried versus the dead being dead. And I know that sounds strange a little bit, but it was important to distinguish the fact that many creatures were not killed necessarily, but contained and kept in some way from recreating the cycle, whether it be through stones, through last rites, through certain types of metals or irons. It was known that to contain a creature was just as good as completely killing it, as long as they weren't disturbed in the process. But Abhartach is not remembered as a seductive creature, a seductive figure of folklore. He's remembered as a warning that the power of abuse in life may refuse to release in death, and that some people did not fear dying, only losing control of that life. But we know by the stories we have heard that folklore alone doesn't provide enough belief. Across Ireland, archaeologists have uncovered burials that don't necessarily follow Christian customs, social norms, or ritual respects. And these aren't mass graves. They're not a result of violence or haste. These graves are deliberate. They're careful, and their quality is an example of fear. So, what if these stories were more than just fiction? Well, in 2004, during the developmental-led archaeological excavation, there was a discovery of an early medieval burial ground that dated back approximately to the 8th and 10th century. The excavation was carried out under standard professional oversight, and the findings were later documented in archaeological reports and academic discussions as strange. Among the dozens of burials that followed the expected Christian practices, 2 graves stood apart. Each contained remains of an adult male, and each male had a stone deliberately placed or shoved inside their mouth, essentially breaking the jaw. This was not a result of a grave collapse or soil pressure or later disturbance like grave robbers. The archaeologist noted that the stone had been intentionally inserted before burial, while the bodies were still being prepared, and the placement required very deliberate effort and intent. Essentially, it was shoved so far back into the skull that it broke teeth and areas of the back crevices of the skull. In later medieval Ireland, Christian burial customs were relatively consistent, but these dead were laid on their back, their angles were twisted, and they resembled more ritualistic practices than Christian standard burials. And because of this, researchers interpreted that the burials were a protective measure, taken not for the dead necessarily, but from the living. And similar practices appeared in burials associated with fear of the dead returning. Blocking the mouth was believed to prevent speech, breath, or consumption. And the very action was thought to revert harm that may come to the living if the dead were to rise. While such burials were well documented in parts of Eastern Europe, they're extremely rare to find in Ireland, making this discovery particularly significant to archaeologists. But, importantly, there is no evidence that the men were criminals or plague victims or social outcasts. In fact, their graves were actually well crafted and constructed, and there were not signs of desecration. So, they wondered if the individuals had been feared. Now, archaeologists don't generally label individuals as vampires because, well, stories are stories, right? But there is believed to be strangeness about these types of burials, including that some of them even had what looked to be puncture marks on the left and right shoulder blades, as well as directly through the heart. It showed that someone believed that these men were so dangerous after death that they went to extreme measures to keep them both silent and contained beneath the earth. This aligned closely with a lot of Irish folklore about the restless dead, not as monsters driven by hunger, but as individuals believed to return when death failed to resolve the imbalance or wrongdoing of their life. And the burials don't prove that Irish people necessarily believed in vampires, as later centuries would have them, but it proved that something quieter and far more unsettling was taking place. In another site in Ógáin, a body was discovered that had not been laid to rest in a peaceful way, but more a secured way. Much like the body before, iron nails had been driven through the remains and into the earth itself, pinning the corpse in place, essentially unable to move. And like the first burial, this was not a random choice. It wasn't careless. It was not a desecration of a grave. It was a precaution. Across both sites, the message seemed to be the same, that the individuals were believed to be capable of returning, not symbolically returning or metaphorically returning, but physically coming back. And in medieval and Irish belief, certain people, those associated with violence, cruelty, and unnatural influence, seemed to be more susceptible to this, and they remained less dormant in death. Illness, livestock death, unexplained misfortune was the catalyst for the fear itself and could be blamed on a restless corpse. And when fear took hold, burial customs, they changed. Stones, positioning, iron, all became part of the way they were buried. And iron being used as a binding force helped weaken or repel what did not belong to the natural world. And we see the use of iron a lot in Fae folklore as well, which we may get into later in the year. But by fixing the body to the soil, the living performed the final act of control over the dead, turning the grave essentially into a barrier rather than a resting place. Taken together, these burial precautions were believed to be a powerful way to keep the dead where they were supposed to be. So Ireland's revenants lore wasn't just stories built of vampires. They were stories of enforced action, of people who altered most sacred aspects of burial in order to ensure that those who were evil or broken or sad or misused in life were not able to come back and wreak that same effect on the living. And these graves were not just legends carved into parchment or written across centuries. They are pressed into the earth. And once you see the pattern, well, the stories stop feeling like superstition and start feeling like warnings. I have one more little tale for you from the Scottish Highlands, where there's an old warning among hunters and travelers to never invite a stranger into the glen after nightfall. Though it's not an Irish folktale of a vampire, it's still one that can be easily connected to a fear of the dead coming back. The story goes like this. 4 men were hunting deep in the Scottish Highlands at dusk when the wind cut sharp through the heather. Fearing the cold, one of them spoke loud and carelessly. "I would give anything for music," he said, "and the company of a woman to dance us warm." No sooner had he spoke those words when 4 women appeared at the edge of the firelight. They were beautiful, pale, graceful, dressed in green silks that shimmered in the moonlight leaves. They smiled softly and offered a dance. 3 men arose eagerly to join them, but the 4th, he hesitated. He noticed something was wrong. As the women moved, their feet never fully touched the ground. Beneath the hems of their gorgeous dresses, he glimpsed something darker. There were hooves, not feet. Realizing the danger the men were in, the man who didn't join the women fled into the trees and pressed himself against a stand of iron-bound horseshoes nailed to a nearby shelter, and he prayed silently through the night. By morning, he returned to the firelight, and the glen was quiet, too quiet. There, the bodies of the 3 companions lay scattered across the grass. Drained of blood, pale as the frost, no wound marks on them, only the terrible stillness of something emptied of life. The women by then were gone, and from that day on, the Highlands remembered them by name. Across ancient Ireland and the Scottish Highlands, people believed that there were moments where the boundary between life and death weakened, when the dead didn't move but lingered. And these were not ghosts. They were not memories of those we loved. They were bodies that still belonged to this earth. Bodies of real people, similar to the ones found by archaeologists. But what makes these practices so terrifying is they weren't isolated to the Celtic regions of the world. They appear again and again across centuries, regions, cultures, who had never spoke to one another. They all had different names. They all carried rituals that were similar, with the same instinct attached. The dead were not always trusted to stay there. So when you hear the old stories of vampires, of the restless dead, of creatures that rise from the grave, they're not necessarily fantasy. What you're hearing is an echo of a time when people believed that survival depended on keeping the dead where they belonged. And maybe that's why the stories never truly disappear, because somewhere deep down, we still carry the ancient fear that death doesn't always mean the end, and that some graves are meant to be sealed, and that some things that are buried for a reason. That's where we'll end tonight's episode, but as I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, this is not where our vampire exploration ends. Next week's episode, we're going to move from the hills of Ireland and Scotland to the busy, bustling streets of New Orleans, where, if legends are true, the vampires of New Orleans still come out to play. And until next time, my spooky friends, stay curious, stay safe, and stay spooky. Bye-bye. This episode was written and produced by me, Shauna, as well as the team here at Let's Talk Spooky. All episode show notes can be found in the description box, including source material and research material used for this episode. If you have a spooky story you wish to share, please send us an email at letstalkspooky podcast@gmail.com, or check out our socials at Let's Talk Spooky.